This is Grampie Bagnall, and he's reminiscing, talking about what we call the olden days, or you call the older days, that we grew up in. Some of the people I knew and some of the things that I did during the course of my life, why I did them and why they were important to me. Everything that I did turned out well for me. In high school, I was president of every organization, including my class a couple of times. And as a freshman, I was getting varsity letters in basketball and baseball. My senior year, I lettered in 5 varsity sports, and I don't know if anybody else has ever done that. I had to push it some to do it, because I ran cross country and had never run cross country. I wound up as captain of the cross country team. But the only national championship that was ever won at Holton High School was their cross country team. Not while I was there, but way back in antiquity. 3 or 4 of the guys got entered in the national meet, and they actually won the cross country championship. And it was a pride to me. Most people probably don't even know that anymore. But everything always seemed to break my way. I don't know how in the world we would have managed to go to college if we hadn't earned scholarships and stood reasonably high in our class. My brother Mike was valedictorian of his class 4 years behind me. And he was sort of in my shadow. And yet he played on a baseball team that won 42 consecutive games while he was in high school. And the shortstop that played next to his second base wound up being in charge of all basketball in the state of Maine. In fact, he came in here and visited me a short time ago. And he had all the officials. He's the one that assigned the officials all over the place. And he recently had a stroke, and it was written up on the front page of the Portland paper.
Wow.
He was well-known, well-liked, nice fellow.
And
And
he was a teammate of Uncle Mike's.
Yeah. He was a teammate and good
double
friend.
play partner.
Yeah. He was he and I talked about that team when he was here. He and Mike were good friends, and so I've been fortunate in having friends not only with people I know, but people like that who knew my son. He knew who I was because of the things I'd done in high school.
Right.
And he also had been by the house as a kid. He was only 4 years younger than I was. So we knew each other and everything, but he came by to see me, and we spent an hour together in here. But your friend, Julie, dropping in here, I knew Julie. I've always liked Julie, and I respect Julie deeply because she has headed everything in Thomaston over there one time or another. And so I have had a multitude of different friends in coming from places you wouldn't think that they would be coming from. I remember when I was in high school and running for the governorship, I got a telegram from out somewhere in Oklahoma, I think it was, and it was a friend of my mother's that she knew, and she said, "We get the Holton Pioneer Times." And I read about, is this your son? And showed she, again, it was followed, you know.
Yeah.
And I look at, well, look, now where do I know people today? I've got this man here.
You reach it? There it is.
I got this phone call one day. I didn't receive it. They received it outside and say, this fellow called you on the phone and would like you to call him back.
Mm-hmm.
Well, who is it?
Richard Seekatheth?
I think Sukforth.
Okay, Sukfor. There you go. That's a you. Okay.
Yeah. I think it's Dick Sutherland. And they just mistaken the
They
name.
mistake.
Oh,
Yeah, that makes sense.
Now, all of my telephone numbers are in a telephone book which disappeared as I moved through the room.
Right.
So I don't have a telephone number for him.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to call this one, and my phone would not. I could not get out of the building.
Mm-hmm.
So in all,
We'll give that a try
first
before
off, I don't know if that is Dick Sutherland, but it came close enough after New Year's Day. And we all got together on New Year's Eve. Yeah. Yeah, Janice has been dead about the length of time that your mother has been dead. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Oh, you were talking about your high school days, and you were talking about sports, but you've always had good stories about some of the places you played.
Oh, yes. Some of the places that athletic events took place in Maine is kind of interesting, really. Normally speaking, you've got to understand the system. Up here, Maine is a state of a lot of small communities, and they're farming communities. They have elementary schools, and they'll get you to the 4th or the 6th grade or something like that, but they don't have high schools. So the state of Maine is peppered with what they call institutes. Maine Central Institute, for instance, is close around Bangor, areas like that. And there are dozens and dozens of these, and nobody today knows what these institutes were. What they were high schools. And when these small communities had kids that they could send to high school, they would send them to a place like one of these institutes or to a high school in one of the bigger towns. Mm-hmm. They had to go elsewhere. So they would board them out, and they would stay with families in the towns where the high schools were. But that's where all these institutes came from. Mm-hmm. There used to be one called Ricker. A little tiny Ricker College was in Houghton. And they had Ricker was built as an institute or a high school for all the Aroostook County schools. So you would go through one of these things and come up with a high school education. So there are people that were fortunate enough, either the town paid their way or their families paid their way to go to high school. And so it was an interesting system, but it was one that existed in the state. These schools still are there, but the history of just what they were is lost in the archives.
Yeah.
And, well, I got to telling somebody about what they were about and how they came about and what the position they filled in the state. They were important.
Yeah.
Now, that was background information leading up to something. I forgot what the something was going to be.
Well, I don't know. I was asking about places you played sports because you've told stories about some of the gyms and baseball fields.
So this is it. You had a lot of these interesting little places like this. And then you had the towns that were just coming into the sports field. And they would have sponsor a baseball team, and they wouldn't have any uniforms. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. And you would play against them like Oakfield and Mapleton and different places. They were small. Mapleton was when you left Prescott and aimed over to the west to Ashland. From there you went north to Portage. And you went through Mapleton. And Mapleton was, the town was in a little valley down here. The school happened to be up on top of a hill beside the road here. And the baseball field was flat ground in front of the high school. And that was an interesting field. The shortstop had to be cognizant of the fact that his left fielder behind him could not see the batter. He was down over the lip of the hill. They used to practice. I'll be standing right here if a fly ball comes. Holler down, the ball's coming your way. And you don't miss it, because if you did, it rolled all the way down into the town of Mapleton.
It was either an out or a home run.
But that was a tremendous home run, the longest home run ever hit down that hill from it. But then that was one. And I think it was Oakfield that used to have a team. And you went to that one, and there was a stream, went right behind first base and behind second base. And the outfielders had to jump over the stream in order to get out to their position. Hopefully you'd finish the game without soaking wet legs, But they played the games in those, and that's the way it was. You had a stream in the middle of your field. It's like the bird nest that you had out in the outfield.
Mm-hmm.
And Thomaston.
Stick a stick so it stands up and stay away from there.
Yeah.
Because the mama bird is not happy if you get too close. I think that was Charlie, yeah?
Yeah, probably Charlie. But he said, shoot, it was funny. You alerted the other team, now stay away from them. First off, we don't want our bird nest disturbed. And secondly, the mama bird doesn't either.
That's right.
Let you know. But that was fine. I remember basketball gymnasium in Woodapitlock, Maine.
Which is fun anyway, just with its name.
Yeah. But the gym was such that you could enter the gym from the end of the basketball floor. The other end was hooked to the school. And people used to come in the end. It didn't cost anything to go to these basketball games. And the thing was, they would come in all through the first period or whenever they get ready to come to the game, and they would come in with their rubber boots and slush and snow and everything and get it on the court. But that was a small part of it. You had to learn that your backboard, which in those days were wooden, had hooks at the top, and it was hung through to. And when they opened the doors, the wind would blow in there, and the backboards would sway back and forth. So you had to be a real good shot to time the swing of the backboard with the shot that you wanted to take. But this was not uncommon to see things like this in the basketball gym. My dad told me about places where he played, and he said the only heat in the gymnasium would be the iron pot-bellied stove, which had to be set somewhere in there to heat the inside of the building. And he said, oh, you get that heated up red hot. And he said it was right at the corner of the floor. He said, we get the other team box down in the corner and somebody give a kid a hip. And they're carrying scars to this day where they burned themselves on that stove.
That's why you once told me that basketball is a contact sport.
Right, it was a contact sport. Now, another place that he liked, and this was at Ricker Institute.
Mm-hmm.
He said they had a gym, but you had to learn how to play in it. And we'd love to have home games there because you had to practice there.
Mm-hmm.
There were beams, low-hanging beams over the basketball floor, so you couldn't take an outside shot without shooting over the beams and coming down through the basketball floor. He said you took a lot of layup shots, but he said you couldn't take a long shot because very few people were good enough or had practiced enough to shoot that over the beams and still had any hope of it going in the back.
Everyone had Wilt Chamberlain on their team up there swatting ball away.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh.
And I remember Charlie telling about going to one of the islands over here to play basketball.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, we had to stay overnight because of the tides and the time the game got over and everything else. And he said, I didn't sleep. I was there. But he said they had a great big old iron stove that heated the house. The thing was, and many iron stoves were this way, if you really took a look at them, there are cracks down through there. You could see the fire burning around all these cracks. It's where the doors open, you put the wood in and all this business. But he said it was interesting, laying there all night long sweating, wondering if we're going to survive the night. And you telling the stories about going out, I think it might have been Vinyl Haven, to play baseball. And you had to play the game according to the tide. You had to head while the tide was out, because first base was actually underwater when the tide was in, and right field, I guess.
Yeah.
And he said you would play these things, and you would you had the time to do this. But at the basketball games, the ferry left at a certain time, and you would see kids running down Main Street with clothes and where they'd been playing in the game, and they'd take them out and say, go to the ferry. And they would go dashing down the road, putting the bags under their arms and everything to go to the ferry.
When we went out there, I was on second string, which meant I had to play to the end, because if I didn't make the ferry, it didn't matter. The first string better make the ferry, because we got another game tomorrow. Yeah.
That's when you really felt the insignificance of the junior varsity. No, we're second string, and we play for the junior varsity. And
that's right.
The name is fine, but we may miss the ferry.
We are keep the bench warm for the stars.
In high school, I went on and did all the high school things and had interesting things. I served as governor of the state of Maine at one time, student governor for a weekend.
Yeah.
I slept in the governor's mansion and a whole bit, made a speech this was all elected by the Highway group, which was active in high schools all over Maine then, very big. And I knew people all over Aroostook County from having played sports and meeting them at meetings and things. And so I had quite a backing to be elected government. A good friend of mine had moved to Dover Foxcroft, and I called him on the phone and said, how about being my chairman down in that area? I don't know if he just laughed or not, but I got backing all over the state. And it was interesting. A lot of interesting things. How I happened to get selected to go to Colby, not quite sure, although I suspect. And that's what led to the stories that I've told you just preceding here a little bit about the institutes and different things that were scattered around for high school kids for towns that didn't have high schools.
Right.
Well, I suspect that I earned scholarships and things down there. I was going to work. I was in the National Guard at the time. I had a little spending money, cash coming in by attending National Guard meetings in downtown Waterville, where Colby is located. Colby is a well thought of school. Its reputation is second to none. So I wound up going to Colby. I think that their attraction to me was the fact that I was from Aroostook County. Now, all of these little high schools up in Aroostook County all channeled their kids to go to Colby, not the University of Maine, but they had to steal students to fill the roles. Mm-hmm. Colby used to be down on the banks of the Kennebec River, and just prior to my time there, they had decided to pick up the entire campus and move it on top of what they call Mayflower Hill, and rebuild it up there. Well, they didn't tear down the old one. The buildings, I guess, are still there as far as I know, down on the river. The old ivy growing up the brick buildings and all this. In fact, we went down and dug up some of the ivy and planted it around our fraternity house at Colby at one time. But so that's what I was going into. I felt that that's why they looked at me. The Institute in Houghton, which used to supply directly, a lot of the people in Houghton went to Colby. And the reason they did is because they went to Ricker for high school. Mm-hmm. And the high school just directed them on to Colby, and it was a pipeline. And this was dwindling because Ricker Classical Institute was just dying out.
Because the smaller towns were starting to have schools.
Right, they had schools of their own. Or went to the bigger high schools, like Presque Isle and Caribou. They had good-sized high schools by then. Mm-hmm. Whereas before, they just had whatever they had to have. But at any rate, that's what I suspect happened. They saw me, and I was interested in going. And they had all kinds of alumni from up in Aroostook County, particularly from Houlton. And that's how I was selected to go there. And working a little bit, I used to work as a janitor in the fraternity house, and they paid me for that, and odds and ends for a little bit of cash. We had another interesting thing. To get our laundry done there, we each had a metal mailing case. And you used to take your dirty clothes, put them in that, strap it all right up, put it in the mail, and send it home to your mother. And the return mail would come back, and the clothes would be clean. You'd put them away and wear them. But this was a laundry process at Colby. I thought it was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But so I went to Colby. And my first year, I happened to get in my dormitory as a freshman with a tremendous group of guys. God, one of them's a lawyer in Honolulu. There were 2 or 3 of them instrumental in everything. Mm-hmm. 2 or 3 of them have got yachts. They come up the coast and they'll attend functions, and I'll meet them there. They have their own boats, you know.
You rent a rowboat to get to them. And
one of them is right at the end of the Massachusetts Turnpike, and he owns a motel, a great big one, a nice one. And he said, "Fred, you travel a great deal on that turnpike." And I said, "I sure do." And I said, I didn't know he had a motel. He says, "Anytime you're traveling," he said, "you come stop at that motel." I never did. But it tremendous. He had a captive audience. People tired of coming in off the turnpike.
Mm-hmm.
And, but that's the nature of the people. I had another fellow, but his father was the Gulf oil distributor for all of New England. Some of these were outstanding kids, and most of them had gone through prep schools in order to get smartened up
Right.
or cleaned up enough to go to Colby. But that's what we ran into. And we had fraternity houses. We had what they called Fraternity Row. Right down through the middle of the campus, there was a row of, all right, the DUs had the first brick building here, and then the Deeks, which was DK Delta Kappa Epsilon, which is the fraternity that I eventually joined. And then the ATOs, and over here on the other side, there were 3 or 4 others, and there were 2 or 3 fraternities, latecomers. These are old, what I've just mentioned, are old fraternities. They've been around for years and years and years. And the Deeks, as they call them, pledged the entire group of fellows on my hall who were such outstanding people. The whole crew of them pledged to go to the Deek fraternity. So we got to know those people pretty well. And I must say that even more than Colby College in the education that I got there, which was a liberal arts education, it didn't impress me as much as the fraternity experience that I had. Adults from up in Aroostook County had been Deeks years ago when they were going to college. They used to show up down there, and they loved to come in with the boys, and sit around, and they would leave with $1 or $2 with each of us for spending money, you name it. But it was just a great place to be. And those ties are as strong as any ties that I made at school, and the fraternity was extremely important to me, as it was to many people. Because after we graduated from Colby, they decided to abolish the fraternity system. They don't have any fraternities at Colby or sororities. They did away with them all, which I can't debate it a whole lot, but Forrest Barnes, a good friend of mine from Holden, was a fraternity brother. And he was very vocal in trying to back up and keep the fraternity system there, because it meant as much to him. His father had been a deacon, all of this business. And his father had been the Speaker of the House in the state of Maine at one time. And so he was known around, but they abolished the fraternities. Now, I don't know what they use them for.
Yeah.
But probably housing. But that disappointed me a great deal, was when they got rid of what I thought was the most important part of my college life. When they didn't have them anymore, you didn't have a home to go to when you went there. So you had to go into a dormitory space, go back for a reunion and live in the girls' dormitory. Did what you could, But it's a lovely school. It still is. It's well thought of. It's growing. And one of my fraternity brothers, shortly after we graduated, within 10 years, he gave $1 million to him. And his wife gave $1 million to the school. They met there. And there's a fellow named Lunder who was tied up with Dexter Shoes, his family. And he has a whole building, the Lunder building, art building. He had an art collection that everybody wanted. and he donated it, gave it to Colby. And they built a building to house it. And he still continues to collect art all over the world. He and his wife do this together. And it's the Lunder Art Museum, I think. But it's something that artists and that type of people, you take that in, see it. You want to see it. It's excellent art. And so that's the type of people I was going to school with. And here I had just come off the farm up from a manure spreader out there. I still had the lumps on the back of my head from the rocks. But they accepted me well. And so when I wanted to be, for lack of anything else, I didn't know what I wanted to do when I got out of college. But I said, this is a liberal arts school, and their arts program is excellent. Anything. So I said, I'll be an English major. And I would like to be a college professor at some point. So I started out taking arts courses, French, English, sociology, all these garbage courses that people take to get A's and B's in. But I took those. But being a liberal arts school, I was required to take a science class as well. And I looked them over, and, well, you had chemistry and biology, and they had a course named geology. And I said, I'll try that. I don't know what it is, but take that class. And I did. And I just had the finest professor, lecturer, that I think I ever had in college. And he used to sell out. He'd stand up in front of the auditorium and give his lectures. And he impressed me. And I wound up with my only A at Colby College in geology. Mm-hmm. And I decided, well, I want to take all the geology I can. And I started taking some geology classes. And it took about all they had to offer there, stratigraphy and paleontology and things of this nature. And came out with a degree. My undergraduate degree is arts degree, BA degree. And with a minor of my emphasis was on geology. Mm-hmm. And to finish up with that, I managed to manipulate that into an assistantship teaching at the University of Maine after I graduated from Colby. And I got my teaching in that I always wanted to do. Mm-hmm. I wanted to be a college teacher. I had a chance to teach. I had my own classes and everything else, and did my own grades. I was a professor. Mm-hmm. So it was good. At the end of my it would have been my senior year, I guess. I was looking for a summer job, and I wanted something related to geology. I said, I want to go out and see what they do with this in the field. And I wound up with a job with a Quebec smelting and refining company. And they sent me up to Chibougamau in Canada. And we lived in a tent up there. I had a couple of prospectors with me. I had a couple of students with me. A couple of them from Colby that went up there too. My intent was somebody will be up there, lead the party in the field, and I will learn from him what they do and get a feel for working in the field that I was interested in. Well, as we get up there, we wound up getting her in Chibougamau, which was a home office. Chibougamau was a town that had swinging door bars and everything else along Main Street.
Yeah.
And prospectors, grubby old characters, and Eskimos, and everything else, you know. But we got acclimated to that, and they sent me up to the field to set up a camp and prospect a certain area that they lined out. And that was what I was to do for the summer, was to prospect this area, take samples so that if there was anything of value, I could have it sent off. I would describe it in books and various things, and I would draw a map, a geologic map of what beds were there and what they looked like and how identifiable they were, and was there anything of value, and write a report to end, you know. Lo and behold, to get up there, and there's no party chief. I found that I was party chief. So I said, well, all right, I'll learn this way. I'll learn by a multitude of mistakes is what we'll do.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had a good occasion up there. We had to cross a river, cut our property in half, and we set up our tent right on a lake, beautiful lake. We flew in a pontoon plane, and when the pilot got there, he said, I'm going to fly over the lake a couple of times. And he said, when I go up on the wings, he said, don't worry, I'm doing this on purpose. He said, what I need to do is get the angle of the sun right on all aspects of this lake. I need to know where the boulders are down under the water. He said, I've never landed here before. So he flew around a couple of times, and sure, you could see the shadows of these rocks down there. And we went into a pontoon plane and landed and offloaded our gear. A couple of grizzly old prospectors came out with the canoe and said, don't you move a damned inch, because they had loaded the canoe with right to the gunwales with supplies that were coming with us, and took them to shore. And we built a platform and built our tent on the platform. And we even had an outhouse, which we built. And we had a guest book in the outhouse so that all of the visiting dignitaries could sign it. We had the president and the pope and everybody could know their names on there.
Whoever you could think of when you had nothing else to do.
All these people who called it jokes, you know. But shoot, it was great because it went right down into a crevice, and it was full of water and just drained into the lake. So it was a beautiful spot for that outhouse.
Yeah.
And it was a lot of fun. You have to dream up somebody to sign up and register every time you went in. But at any rate, that's where I spent that summer. And the river that I mentioned, it cut the property in half. We had a chestnut canoe with sponsons on the side, which are big floats, so to speak. They're built into the boat, but it's to keep the boat from tipping over because it was a working tool. And it had an outboard motor. And we'd use that to cross the river or downriver to the end of the property on the other side. And it was fun. You got used to that river so that you could crank up that motor and just let her go. Which is just what I was doing one day when I wondered if I didn't lose the whole crew and myself. But all of a sudden the motor roared, and something that we had hit with a boat. And I looked, and what had happened was the front of the boat had gone up, and the motor, it was high enough so that the motor was out of the water and just roaring at full speed. And I got to looking at it, and there was a boulder down under it that I'd never seen before. Oddly enough, I was sure I knew that river well, but the top of that boulder had a V in it, and I hit right in the middle of the V with the front prow of that boat, and it went right into the V. And we were isolated, sitting up at the top of this rock. Well, I went to one end, and you got the boat off all right, but I didn't go near that at high speeds anymore. But it's a wonder I didn't go an inch or two in either direction, and we'd have been overboard to that canoe. All right, Chibougamau. As I told you, it was a swinging door town. That was really something out of the Old West.
Mm-hmm.
And but that's not really part of my story. That's where I was.
Mm-hmm.
The next summer, I went to work for the same company, and they had a property up in Ungava. There's an Ungavan Peninsula further north in Quebec province, and the Ungavan Peninsula is higher, way up above the tree line. No trees, no bushes, nothing, just blank nothing up there. It was not a place of beauty. And we couldn't even land on the lake with pontoon planes. So how do you get an airplane? Never when there are no runways. The thing is, the summer season, which is when you need to be there to do the field work that we were sent up there to do, is so short that you hardly get the winter over with when all of a sudden it's winter again.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we did is landed at skis. And that plane skied, and there was supposed our base camp was up there, and the 2 or 3 fly camps or field camps around it. Not in sight of each other. It was miles between camps, these flyers.
Mm-hmm.
And we were one of the flyers and had to go out and find, with no landmarks, no trees, no rocks, no mountains or anything. You had to find where you were and set up and hope that you were where you thought you were. We had one strip of aerial photography that was along one border of the property. That's all we had to locate by. But there was a lake in front of the base camp. Mm-hmm. And from there, they supplied the flyers or whatever was needed. And it was a flat place out there. Mm-hmm. And they would come into the skis and they could land on the lake. Yeah. And what you did is you loaded your stuff into a bombardier tractor with a trailer on it. And you went out searching for this, have no idea where the property lines were of the area that you were responsible for the conducting a field work, looking at it. So you didn't know. We went down as far as we could, and we said, now, according to the scale that this aerial photography was supposed to be flown at, we're reasonably sure that the base camp knows where it is. And if that's true, we need to go 2.5 miles down here to come to the property, and we'll find a place down there that's flat enough to set up your tents, which we did. And the thing is, you had to land with the skis, and you had to go in while everything was still frozen up, because if you waited until it thawed, the field season was all over. We set up our tents, and you sat in those tents and waited, actually melted down to the ground till the ground was free and you could get on it, go out and map it. Essentially the same type of job or the same work I was doing the previous year, and drawing maps and what all. I've got all the mounds around there that look like I called them mountains for the sake of naming them so that we would have little keepsakes for the. I had more girlfriend names on these mountains, and they don't even know that
they're famous.
I wouldn't be surprised if those names didn't stick to some of them up there. They're still there. But one morning, I said, "Look, I'm getting sick and tired of laying here in my cot. I'm going out and do some looking around." Well, there was nothing to look at. There wasn't even a tree to climb or a bush to whittle on. I said, "I'm going to dig a hole in the ice, see how deep it is." So I went and said, "This has got to be the middle of the lake or pretty well out here." And we had brought a long pole with a chisel on the end of it. Why we happened to have it, I don't know. But I took it and I started digging a fish hole in the ice. And at 14 feet, I brought up dirt.
Oh.
It never did hit water at all.
All the way down 14 feet.
All the way down to the bottom. But I'm not sure if all of the ice in the lake actually thawed in the summer. Or some of it, ice, may have been attached to the bottom down there and just simply stayed the upper. Like any body of water melting, you get the melt water on top of the ice. And but we eventually came out of it. We had a windstorm one night and it just knocked our camp down. And another time, you stored your canned goods and food and everything else. There was no place in the tent for these things. We used to store it, lay it on a tarpaulin, and fold half of the tarpaulin over the stuff so that it wouldn't get buried in the snow blowing and all this business. I made one mistake. I had the flap side to the east. And one night, I could hear this pop, pop, pop going on. I was like, what in the world is that? Is it a tent rope or something slapping in the wind? And went out and here a cache of food is all ablaze. And there was no question. But I figured out what happened. Where we had that tarpaulin flopped over the top, the wind got under one part of it, blew the top off. And when the sun came up, it shone. We got butter in cans. That's the way, and I think you can buy it in Canada now, in cans. And it started to shine through vinegar bottle or something that was beside it, and this intensified the heat on the can of butter. And that grease must have gone out through the seams in the can, and finally with the sun and that magnification on it, it caught fire and just burned it all. We didn't have a thing left, but we did have a two-way radio that we could communicate with. That was fine. We had other camps around in the area calling to see how desperate we were, that they were all right and could get us anything we needed, and we never had to.
So what were the popping sounds you had heard?
The cans, they were under pressure. And when they would go up, they would swell and they would explode. That's what the popping sound was. That woke us up. And I didn't have good summer on with fires.
Yeah, sounds like it.
We got ready to leave in the fall. Took our tents and set them up at the base camp, and the plane would come in, pick us up, take us out. And I looked down at my tent, and I had, I'm sorry, this would have been between my 2 years at the University of Maine that we went up there. And I was collecting material for a thesis. And I was collecting rock samples. I was going to cut thin sections and look at them and identify the minerals and and have a nice little report on that as a thesis. And I had that, and I had identification of each of the samples tied to the map that I had drawn, which was the company's map. And I had little numbers on them so that I could identify on the map where the sample was taken. And I had these all packed up and ready to ship on out and everything else. And looked down, and my tent was on fire. See, the wind blew all the time up there, and everything dried up. So my thesis, well, the rocks were still there, but the tagged rocks weren't there anymore. I could redraw the map from the notes that I had in a book that I carried with me. And I could have recreated the geologic map that I'd drawn. It was pretty uninteresting anyway, but so I had troubles with fires up there.
That must have been a pretty empty feeling when you found that out.
Yeah. Oh my. And really trying to come up with a thesis subject. It was just one that I sort of pulled out of the air. My roommate and I had an office mate at the University of Maine. We're both graduate students, and they're teaching assistantships. And we had started to write a thesis, gather material, on eskers in the state of Maine. And I had a friend in one of my classes that was a pilot, and the government, it was an Army pilot, and the government paid him to keep his license valid to fly. And he says, I have to fly so many hours a week. He said, I'll fly you over these glaciers, or eskers. And why don't we start way up north and start coming down the Penobscot Valley and following them and see where they branch and whatever they do, you know. And I came to the realization of how smart people were early when they started building roads. They would build them on top of these eskers, which are all gravel. And that's where all the gravel pits in the state of Maine are, in one of these eskers. But if you put your road along the top of the esker, you don't have that water damage done to it that you would if it was built down in the lowland. And it drains so well that it was a logical place to put it. That's where they put it. And say it's like the corduroy roads they built through swamps.
This is what we have. Let's be smart.
But we had visited gravel pits that I didn't know existed. There are so many in Bangor and around it that's where people went to get the gravel and then screen it, and they'd use some of it on the roads. And some of it they'd throw away. But we had all of this stuff gathered, and I can't remember why we had to stop that project. But we did, and I was left without it. No, that's the one we went into. I had already been to Canada and tried to do the stone collection and lost my margin. When I came back, my roommate said, well, look, why don't the two of us go together and write a joint thesis, which we did. And it was known as the Penobscot Valley Esker. And the Library of Congress now has the Penobscot Valley Esker system mapped it. But we used to take samples of the stone and sieve it to see if the type of minerals and things in it would lead one of the branches of this esker to a particular stone deposit. Be a granite up here and a shale over here, and so some of that stuff in the granites would be beautiful, and some of the stuff coming out of the shale was just nondescript. But it was an interesting thing. We had tons of samples of things that we had sampled, It was really too big a project. But that's what our thesis project was and what became of it, and my blundering into a thesis topic. So to me, my thesis topic was not exciting, and it wasn't something that I was really that interested in.
But it got to your degree.
It got to the degree, graduated in good shape, and I found that I really was a reasonably good teacher. And of course, one thing of interest that I found, you'd get your normal freshman class, a group of them, just taking geology, But every once in a while, the forestry department would say, look, we want you guys to take geology. You need it for some of the coursework that you're going to encounter in the forestry department. And these guys were halfway through college. They had to take this, and we're told they had to take it. No interest whatsoever in geology. You go into class in the morning, and this real nice quartz crystal that you had sitting back on the back shelf, you would find it floating through the air as the kids were tossing it as a football and all kinds of stuff like that. I said, oh boy, it was a good thing I was their same age. I could appreciate what they were doing. And yet when I spoke, they listened to me too. And I was pretty good at giving them a sob story. I said, you're going to get me killed or conned or something. But that got me through the two colleges. 2 weeks after I graduated from the University of Maine, I was drafted into the Army. And they wound up sending me to Fort Dix, New Jersey for basic training. Well, of course, I'd been in high school. I had been in the National Guard. And I had a set of sergeant's stripes that I had earned in the National Guard. And I knew how to march. I knew these basic things that the Army teaches at basic boot camp. And so when I went to boot camp, they said, you've got want to use your talents. Here, we'll give you a room in the barracks. It's the only room in the barracks. This is your bedroom. So fortunately, because of my previous experience, and I was older than some of these kids, so I'd have died trying to keep up with them if I hadn't. I had a leg injury at the time that I'd gotten in college. And my platoon, when I had them out marching, we would sing these marching songs and everything else. We had to be pretty good. We knew how to march, and we could reverse and all this business with the best of them. But they'd say, here comes the limping patrol. I call cadence for the limp because of my leg. And everybody laughed at that. That's the limping patrol. I said, they may be the best we've got, but that's the limping patrol. And I tore that leg up again at the field day that they had in basic. I had a girlfriend over in New Rochelle, New York, and she used to come over on weekends and take me to over there, and we were a thing for a while. And she used to be my next door neighbor in Holton. Yep. We got back together again. I always liked her. When I was a class president, we had an event or something going. She never was in anything. She was quiet and backward. I always made it a point to pick her out and said, would you head that committee for me? or would you be on it?
Mm-hmm.
And so I tried to include her in things, and we thought a lot of each other. In fact, there was one night I was over there visiting, and before I went back to the base that night, she took me. She said, Fred, she said, I know you've got some interest in me, but you know that I've got another boyfriend. She said, he is on the verge of asking me to marry him. She said, if you have any interest in me, now is the time to ask me.
Wow.
So she practically proposed to me. And I didn't have any money.
Right.
I had 2-year commitment in the Army. I didn't have a job. I didn't know what geologists really do in the field. And I said, look, I cannot commit myself to a marriage at this point. But I've kept up a relationship with her ever since. When I would be in Washington, D.C., her husband eventually had a job in Washington, lived in Arlington, and when I was in Washington for one reason or another, I'd get on the phone and call her, and we would have a good discussion.
Mm-hmm.
The last time I tried here recently, I got to thinking about her, and come to find out she was quite ill. I think she was too sick to even talk on the telephone to me. I talked to her brother-in-law, maybe. Yeah, she was living with her sister at that time. But little phase.
Mm-hmm.
I went on, and it's a good thing I did. The good Lord was looking out for me and had his plans set for me.
Mm-hmm.
And you. So, I was there at Fort Dix, finished that up. No exciting outside business. But then it came, basic training was over. And the Army, in its infinite wisdom, dispersed all of the people to the units where they were going to be stationed and learn how to shoot guns and build mines, plant mines, and all that business. And they felt that I would be a good mathematician and physicist, knowing nothing about either one of them. They sent me to Huntsville, Alabama, which was an interesting place. There is stuff that probably is over in Russia as a basis for their scientific community. The United States did the same thing. They creamed off all the scientists they could get and brought them to this country. Russia got first choice, and many of them, they got first choice because they got there first.
Mm-hmm.
But
keep talking. I'm going to grab a drink so you can have it if you want. Just keep talking, and if you want to look them in the eye, there's the spot.
All right. But these were interesting days. I eventually, later on in my story, will tell about the time that I lived when I was in the Army and worked at Huntsville, Alabama. At the time I was there, one of these German scientists, or many of these German scientists that came out of the Second World War were German. They had captured them, and Werner von Braun was the head man at the Redstone Arsenal. And so that's how the distribution of the brain power was. Everybody tried to steal from the Germans because they were well advanced in everything they did. There were the people, the soldiers, were a small unit in Huntsville. The rest of them were all civil servants, and that were working there. And Werner von Braun from Germany, the German scientist, rocket expert. He still is considered one of the geniuses of that type of life. He was there. He never shook my hand, but I did see him getting on the bus one day. It was that sort of a relationship.
Yeah.
But each one of the departments where we did work throughout the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, whatever they did in the other departments, I don't know, but we studied flutter and vibration analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And measured the frequency of slosh because they used liquid fluids in their rockets.
Mm-hmm.
And as it began to go up, the rocket would tremble and or rock even, and you would get this slosh in the bucket. It took them a while to find out what the trouble was, but these vibrations and slosh actually broke 3 or 4 of these missiles in half after they had taken off. They set up a frequency with the vibration in the sides or whatever container, and it took them a while to realize what had done it. And flutter and vibration analysis for the ones who were trying to measure this and protect against it, new rockets. And it was an interesting philosophy, but kind of boring in nature, you know. What I did is day after day go through computer printouts and read these various things. But the first solution they came up to was, how do you keep these vibrations with the wave action in the top of the liquid fuel? Well, obviously, you take a bunch of beer cans and you weld them all together and you drop it in on the top, and that holds the
because it's not solid, but
it's right
sturdy.
there.
Yeah,
Moved and bent. So that was the first solution. There obviously have been other things since. But I was at Redstone Arsenal, Huntsville, Alabama. Each of the segments had a German scientist, maybe 2 German scientists. But the interesting thing is, this group of men that I was with, the soldiers, God, these were people, well, I guess you'd call many of them misfits. They had either owned businesses of their own and had experience working in industry somewhere, or had a valuable commodity like that they felt that the Army could put to use for them. Me as a mathematical physicist, I don't know what they expected of me, but at any rate, that's who we had. The guy next to you could be a PhD in physics. And he got drafted into the Army. Somehow he wasn't smart enough to lead the draft. But I remember in particular, the group they had, again, how in the world would a group of people like this, with the talents they had, I would tend to float to the top. I never have understood why I could do this. But at any rate, these guys would get together, and they were not utilized the way they should. They'd sit down, they'd write a letter to their congressman. And it became a problem. And the congressman said, straighten it out. Army, solve your problem. So they established what they called a scientific and professional council, whereby some of us were elected to positions to hear the complaints of these people, to keep them from writing letters to their congressman. And they would come to us with them, and we would try to explain it, and we would take it to the regular Army people who were in charge of our barracks. They were the only soldiers there. The rest of us were soldiers in name only. And so we had the Scientific and Professional Council. We would hear the complaints, and apparently it pretty well did its job, although once a photograph appeared taken from the top of our barracks down into the large parking lot. A lot of the guys had cars and everything. And it showed the entire platoon. It was a Saturday morning, and everybody was either had a pass or had a pass that would become effective when they were done with their Army chores.
Right.
Okay. These fellows were lined up at one end of the parking lot, and each of them had a push broom. And they were supposed to start that way and finish the other end. All the cars were moved out. And this fella had seen fit to take a picture of these fellas. This one, he's a CEO of the Cincinnati Steel Casting Company, and the air going down to him and a PhD in physics, head of the laboratory.
Right.
But the fellow that, another interesting story is a digression here. They used to have a firing range for these missiles. And they used to strap the missile down and fire it, really test firing right off the ground, only it was strapped down so that it couldn't leave the ground. And they had a lake that they had built under it. And great plumes of gas and everything would go up into the air. And you go into that building, observation building, pretty well back from the rocket, needless to say. And on a shelf behind it, it was just a viewing room is what it was. You went in and you looked out the front and you watched the rockets. Up on the top, the helmets across there. The President of the United States had one. And then the four-star generals were up there. Oh, they had all of the cadre, and at one time or another, these people had been there to observe test firings.
Right.
One of our guys was the man to press the button. But let her rip, and you could have the governor of the state, you could have anybody there watching. And one day, they had gathered a group like this together. And they said, get the guy, tell him to press it, shoot it. Well, he's not here. What do you mean he isn't here? We've got the governor and everybody standing here watching the proceedings. Where is he? Boy, he's got KP this one. Oh, that didn't happen again. But that is the sort of thing that you ran into. The regular Army wanted, look, we have got to handle the food situation, getting the highway, the parking lot cleaned, and all this business. All of this business has got to be done, and the soldiers are supposed to do it. So he wasn't there. What? We all used it to laugh about, but it's one of the complications between that.
Right.
But at any rate, this picture came out, and you had all of these people with the little blurbs pointing down to them, and it didn't help. But when you look out the back, you were looking at a field, and in it, then they had initials cut out of the hay. So that you could read very vividly. FTA, it says, fornicate the Army, I didn't know. But at any rate, this picture got circulated in pretty good shape. I never saw anybody out pushing broom in the parking lot again either. But about that time, some of the men came to me. I happened to be named the president of the Scientific and Professional Council. So it was me that used to talk to the Army people. And they began to come to me and said, Fred, we're not quite sure if you know this or not, but a group of us are just to the point where we can't stand sitting in this barracks and telling lies from our bunks and all this all day long, and in the evening there's nothing to do. We have gone downtown and we have rented a building down there, one of these southern mansions. He said it's on the finest street in Huntsville. And he said, we have established a fraternity. We'll come up with the name later. And we don't know how it's going to sit with the military. How would you feel about, as president of the Scientific and Professional Council, making an approach to them? And they explained to me that this is going to be a formal, this is not a junk, this was not something that was going to terrify people. We realized that we were in the finest neighborhood in Huntsville. He said the people sit on their verandas up and down the street, and at first they used to look askance at all of these GIs in civilian clothes generally, coming down and sitting on our veranda, or going into the house, or going in and drinking a beer or something like this. Said, we're going to have it formal. There's going to be nobody that gets overly imbibed in beverages. And they said, if we have a party and say it's formal, the girls will not be tramps off the street. They will be people that come in formal dress. We will be in full dress uniform. We have told the neighbors this, that it's a formal thing, and we would like to be accepted as neighbors here. Lo and behold, cowboys would be sitting out on that porch at times, and the neighbors would come with lemonade and sandwiches and join them. And they liked having them there because they kept it clean. The trash wasn't blowing into the yard, and there was an old barn in the back that the guy said, we're going to tear that old barn down. Well, that elated them. They'd wanted the barn gone for years. But at any rate, I went to the Army and I said, look, you know, how many people have you sent from the base here since in the immediate future or past that on a Section 8 that just mentally could not handle being in the regimented
and cooped up and
And I said, they have taken the solution in their own hands and established a fraternity. And I explained what I've just explained, that it is a formal thing, it's clean, they're going to keep it that way. And the neighbors have accepted them there. But they are concerned about what the Army would think about it. Well, the young fellow there, he says, I don't know just exactly what think, but what's wrong with it? It may be the only fraternity in the Army, but let's do it. And I said, fine, I'd like to issue you a personal invitation, you and all of the other gentlemen, to come to a party on, it was 2 or 3 weeks. I said, it is a formal party. We would expect you to come in full dress uniform. We will all be in full dress uniform or in suits and ties. But we're going to invite girls to come, and they will be in formal dress. And we will alert the neighbors that it's a formal party, that it's not going to get out of hand. If somebody gets to drinking too much, we will take it internally and solve the problem, which we did. And we physically take these people, and they migrated upstairs. And they accepted the invitation, and the fraternity was established. Well, by that time, I was a member of the fraternity and was a charter member of this fraternity. And I guess 25 or 30 years after I'd gotten out, I got a letter from a buddy of mine who is the president and owner of the Cincinnati Steel Casting Company, who was in the fraternity with me. He said, Fred, he said, interestingly enough, he said, that fraternity still exists down there,
Huh.
that long afterward. And he said they're having a reunion, particularly interested in charter members as they get there.
Ha.
He said, I would fly over to wherever I was at the time. I don't remember, but it was the East Coast.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I'd like to have you go down to the reunion with me. It was the type of thing that he would eat up, you know. And he flew his own plane. And that in itself is an interesting story as to how I met him. But he did. And I didn't go to the reunion, but they had it. But it still existed after 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
So the Army had accepted it. And apparently it was doing the job that both sides, if you will.
Right. They recognize that it's a unique position to actually be
Yep.
more of a scientist, but you're in the military, but it's not really a military mindset.
That's right. They never did get the military arms set, so to speak. They couldn't handle that. And so this cut down, I never knew of a fellow that had to leave the Army after that from that group.
Mm-hmm.
They had a place, and what they did is they would stay right down there at the fraternity house. They would come back to every lineup in the morning where they call out, yo, ho, yay, ho, all this business. They get that done, and they would go in and they would see that the bunks were made up and everything was dusted and cleaned up. The Army required. And, well, any day they would have gone to work.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so they just simply went to work from the fraternity house, but they did the chores that the Army required of them, and they never had a problem that way.
Interesting.
So it was an interesting experience.
Yeah.
The fraternities itself was kind of interesting. The refrigeration was a bathtub in the middle of the kitchen floor, filled with ice and beer.
Mm-hmm.
Each of us had a little locker, but held a padlock on it, door on the front, we'd build it ourselves, and you kept your beer or liquor or whatever you were going to have or wanted in that locker, and nobody got in anybody else's. But, and in a group like that, they know how to do anything. You had electricians in there, they had sound systems, hi-fis into every single bedroom and nook and cranny in that building. We put up curtains. Well, we decided we were going to have good vellum curtains, I guess. And we used masking tape to hem them. Oh, when the girls from the fraternity came to that party and they saw what we used to put the curtains together, they got sewed, they got put together. But that in itself was interesting. We had our formal our party. We needed females. Well, some of the fellows knew nurses from the hospital, or were dating other girls around. It was explained to all of them that this was a formal party and that they would be in formal gown. And I happened to have made a connection in Birmingham with the Beta Sigma Phi sorority people. Sometime, I don't know how I got invited to it, but they had a citywide supper one night, recognition supper or something, because your mother was on the stage at a table up there. It may have been when she received her Girl of the Year trophy. I don't know, or don't remember. But at any rate, it probably was through her that I got an invitation to this great big thing. Well, Sue's sorority, Sue, I call her that because I became more intimately familiar with her as time went along. She, as I came to future events in Birmingham, I no longer slept at the YMCA. I would sleep at the Havern household. Her mother is someone that insisted that no, you ever go to the YMCA again, you come out here. We've got a bedroom in the back. I later found out that I was taking my Sue's bed away from her. She went to another room and had the bed there, and I got her room. But her mother thought a great deal of me, and we got along nicely, and I just loved that family. Oh, they're just great. As most of our boys would tell you, they know the relatives down in Utah and various places in Alabama. They're top-notch, nice people. And but at any rate, I went to this party, Beta Sigma Phi. Sue belonged to a sorority made up of working single girls. And I said, well, what ideal situation this is. And I offered an invitation to any of them that wanted to come as a group, say. But it was formal. They would be responsible for paying for their overnight if they were going to stay overnight. And that we couldn't afford to bring a batch of girls like that and pay them. So at any rate, they came up and they rented a motel, or rooms in a motel. There must have been 8 or 10 of them anyway that came. And they all came and joined us. 2 of us married girls out of that sorority, and another one would have. Only the girl was a typical Southern girl and would not leave home. And the boy lived in California, and he wanted to marry her, and she wouldn't leave home. And so it turned out very nicely for very many of us. And the president of that fraternity, Sue, up on the stage and all this business, and her infinite wisdom invited me to sit up on the stage in a chair next to her. And I remember standing up and knocking the table off over the front of it. But such as it is, you get one of these army clubs and put him in a formal occasion. But they came in formals, they loved it, and they came back to future parties. They used to use the same set of rooms at the same motel. It had a swimming pool there, so it was great for the GIs to go down there and be able to swim in their pool on days. They normally would come and stay for the weekend, you know.
Yeah.
So you spent a lot of time together.
Yeah.
But that is how I got to know your mother. And that plus the invitation from her mother to stay at their home. Anytime I was in Birmingham, I'd sort of adopted that family, never giving a thought to our relationship with your mother. We knew each other, we liked each other, we went out together and all this business. And I remember the day that I left. Oh, and the brothers and sisters and cousins, they all gathered and sent me on my way. And my only thought was, I'm going back to Maine. I'm going back to home. And won't I be glad to get there? Never giving a thought to marriage or a girl or anybody else. And all this time, I found later, my future wife knew, yeah, he'll be back. And interestingly enough, I came back up to Holton. And I guess after a couple of weeks, I was wandering down Main Street, familiarizing myself with the home. And I walked by this jewelry store. I said, you know, I can't afford one of those cheap rings, you know. So I went in and got it. And I said, why in the world wasn't I more alert less dumb. While I was down there and taking care of this thing, I'm lonesome now. I miss that girl. And I said, I'm going to send her a ring, see what happens. And I did. I wrapped it up in a box and put it in the mail and shipped it down, called her on the telephone. I said, look, I've sent you a present in the mail. I said, you can accept it or reject it. If you reject it, just throw it away. It's not that expensive or anything. And all this time, she knew what it was. I thought it was a big secret, because I had no intention of sending her a ring or anything else. But I did. I packaged it up. I sent it. Somebody was guiding my hands and directing my thoughts, because that was the crux of the greatest establishment and event in my life, bar none. She said, we will watch for the box and see. Oh, all this time, everyone in the family, her mother, her father, and my wife, and her brother Charles was almost always over there. He loved to come over and eat dinner at their house. But he knew that this was in the mail and coming, and he suspected what it was. They all suspected that it was a ring. And they figured, all right, this is the day the ring will arrive in the mail. And Charles said, I'm going to be there. And it comes up, he was there when the ring came to the house. And he said, I can't wait. He said, I got to open it to be sure that it's the ring. And he opened it, and it was the engagement ring. And he says, I'm going to call Sue and take it down to her, because Sue was in anticipation of knowing what was in the box too. So he called her, and he said, Sue, he said, I'm going to come down. Can you meet me out in the parking lot in about 10 minutes? Sue was a secretary, office manager type of person at the Barrett Division of Allied Chemical at the time. And Charles has told me afterward. In fact, he told me this whole story afterward. And I didn't know it happened. I didn't know it was going to happen. But he took the ring and he went down into the parking lot. And he said, I looked up at that building on all of the windows, 2 stories or 3 stories, I've forgotten where it was. He said, people were crowded in every window up there, looking down at me in the parking lot. And he said, I waited there. Sue came out. And he said, I get down on my knees. And he said, I propose for you. And put the ring on her finger, which I thought was just great.
Yep.
And I guess everybody did. And people have gotten a kick out of that story when I tell it, but that's what happened.
That's a good one.
And it was a while afterward that my mother and dad, my mother told me later, she said, the minute I met that girl, I knew you were going to marry her. I said, you did? Why didn't you tell me? Yeah. But they came down to the wedding and we got married, which was later. But very, very interesting the way that came about. And one other little story, and I don't know whether it's the truth or not. Her sorority sisters were all at the wedding. And after the wedding, Sue and I took off on a honeymoon, I suppose. We were going to go over to Atlanta. I've forgotten what we were going to do, but at any rate, it was, they used to always follow the bride and groom out of town in the cars.
Yeah.
And I looked behind ours, and her sorority sisters had 2 or 3 cars back behind ours and were following us, and they kept going and stopped at a stop sign coming out of Birmingham. And stopped at a traffic light, and one of the girls, a little one, cute little girl, hopped out of the car and came over and got ours. And I said, you know, we're going to Atlanta. She said, that's all right, I'll go too. Said, I wanted to be on somebody's honeymoon someday anyway. And I said, okay, you're welcome. Everybody's welcome. Well, we drove almost to Atlanta. I wouldn't let her out of the car. I said, you get in, you're going to stay. I said, I don't know just where you're going to sleep, but finally the car caught up with us and they transferred cars. But this is a story that you can't swear to, but we honeymooned after that, packed up the car and decided we would come up all the way from Birmingham to Maine on Route 1, go through the little villages and everything else, and this would be our honeymoon trip. We didn't have any money, and so we started. And that first night, we stopped at a motel and went in and registered, and this is where we were going to be. And we learned later we were right at the end of the airport runway, so that every plane that took off had to fly right over our hotel room, wake us up. And I'll swear that one of those ventures of being waked up all night long on our honeymoon night that the oldest son was conceived, because he was born almost 9 months after we were married. So I figured that sure fits the story, and it could be true. Yeah. So we got to Thomaston. I had a job waiting for me up there at the cement plant. I was the assistant chemist, assistant geologist. And we had an apartment on Main Street in Thomaston. And I worked there for 2.5 years at that job. And the corporation asked me if my family would like to move to another location. And that would have been the first one was Martinsburg, I think. And down in Martinsburg, West Virginia. And I said, why not? What would the job be? Well, you'll be in charge of all quality control down there. You'll have the laboratories to take care of. You will take care of the chemistry. You will straighten out chemical problems with the product. You will take care and assist with the underground operations in Martinsburg. And I said, it sounds good for this point in my career. I said, it's been, 2.5 years that I was in Thomaston. And I said, Hank Allen was my boss at the plant in Thomaston. And I said, he's ahead of me. I'm not going to move anywhere. They've taught me how to make cement, and I appreciate it. I love the people there. And so maybe it's time for me to move. So we moved to Martinsburg and worked there for, again, about 2.5 years, I think. And the gateman said, how would you like to go back to Thomaston? I said, well, what have I got to gain by going back to Thomaston? And they hemmed and hawed, but I wound up in Thomaston and again for a short period of time, and then West Virginia, Martinsburg. I'm sorry, we've already been to Martinsburg.
That's okay.
But we moved to Arbutus, Maryland, where I worked as a sort of a roving raw materials expert for the corporation. And that was fine. We rented a house there. I made some very good friends there, and we loved the church there, and we became very active in the church there. And I said it was a great place. But after, I think, another 2.5 years, they asked me to come back and be the assistant manager of the plant in Thomaston. I said, in that case, I will go back. I'll be in charge of all raw materials and the quality and everything like this. In fact, as the assistant manager, I was in charge of about everything. And I came, and that worked out well too. And this time we bought a house on Main Street, and you boys all were in existence at that time. And I went to high school at Georges Valley. And Mike, did he make it into school at Georges Valley?
No.
I don't think he ever did, but both you and Charlie did.
Yeah, Mike, when we moved back to Columbia, Mike was in middle school then.
Yeah.
I was still in high school then, so I started at Georges Valley.
That's right, because we looked for a soccer school for you to go to, right?
Ha! That's a bust.
You came home that first night and said, Dad, I'm not going back there. We figured you were a shoe and they would cheer you coming on the court. You're the state champion in Maine.
My name was at the top of the list of cuts. First one gone.
Oh, my. But you were one of the better baseball players they had. You would have had the varsity catcher's job. But the catcher that was there had been there for 4 years. And that was the only reason you didn't start as a catcher, as I recall it. Yep. So that was an important stop.
Yep.
And interesting people, too. Columbia was an interesting city to live in. A city, a community. Yeah, the Cherokee Jew that lived down the street, and a Chinese woman that used to love to have Mike come down there. He would eat anything. And, oh, yes, he's coming. Well, she would have a layout for him when he got there. And after that, we wound up out in Davenport, Iowa. And at that point, I was in charge of all quality control, raw materials, and everything, and was in line to be the assistant manager of that plant. And there was a children when I was here in Thomaston the last time, I realized that they were grooming me to be a plant manager. And they started telling me what I should do as a plant manager. And I said, you're talking to me about managing the people that taught me how to make cement. And I said, these people are important to me. And I said, no way am I going to step up to a man that's got 30 years experience and taught me how to do the things I could do and made me the man that you thought could be a plant manager.
Yeah.
I said, I am not interested in stepping into the plant manager's job here or anywhere. I said, it's the same thing. If you're going to manage it, manage it. If I'm going to manage it, give it to me and let me manage it. I said, otherwise, I'm not interested in it. So we wound up actually going to work out and living and staying in the Quad City area out there, which again was a lovely experience. I liked living there.
Yeah.
And I enjoy my pictures with the jets practicing flying over the house, all of this business. Yeah.
You talked about making friends everywhere, and just in this week, talking with Charlie, You've talked about the Allens, who then were your friends again when he was your boss in Baltimore. We just talked about the Sutherlands a minute ago. Charlie and I talked about the Simons, and you and I talked about the Basslers.
Yep.
You've just made good friends everywhere.
Yep, all over the country. They're spattered everywhere. And when you start talking about kids that you used to bring home from college, shoot, Mike tells me about being in contact on the punch buttons there.
Yep.
He keeps in contact with all of these people. And he says, all these people, you've told me about the Basslers asking about me and other people that he knew. The veterinarian.
Lee.
Lee Wilberdine is, yep, I still think that him coming up here to be a vet came at the time when we moved up here, and it was Mike and our influence and somebody he knew that enticed him to do that. And since then, he's moved around a great deal, and he's built his life. He could put the pieces together like I've been doing here the last couple of days, and probably if he ever thought of it, he'd say, you know, life's worth living. And you know, something else I was thinking, the farm up in Portage Lake has always had an influence on me. And I've got to think that when we moved to anywhere, there was no garden in the backyard. And one of the first things that I ever did, any of those places, was to go on up with a spading fork and dig up a garden and start raising something out there in the garden about flower beds. And all of that is the fact that that's faith. It's part of God's blessings. When I put a seed in the ground, what hope do you have that that is going to grow, particularly in new soil that's never been anything that you know of? And yet you've got every faith that that's going to grow, and you're going to be able to eat it if it's something you eat. And I've done this every single place that we have been. And you too.
I have too.
Taken the garden, and your wife is very susceptible to doing the same thing. I think she was impressed with our Martinsburg garden down in the backyard. She used to love that. Until I told her that those onion seeds have to be placed one at a time.
You have to remember, she spent summers on a farm too.
Yeah, it doesn't leave you, it becomes part of you. I do remember one other incident that I learned from, and it was kind of a sad thing. In my class, I had a bunch of freshmen, and there was a young fella in there, nice kid, and he was in the first papers that they said. It might have been a test or something, I don't know. But when I looked at his paper, I had never seen anything like that in my life. I looked at it, and the words didn't even make a sentence. He might put two or three together, and he could quote it to anything meaningful. And needless to say, when it came to exam time or anything else, complete F. He couldn't do anything with studying and learning. And I remember midway, 2/3 of the way through the year, he had been working at it, everything else. I went home, and here's this fellow sitting on a concrete stoop at the front door of our house. And I said, "Oh, what's going on here?" And I went over and I sat down beside him, and I said, "What's the trouble? Can I help you?" And he says, "I came to apologize to you, Mr. Bagnall. He said, I wanted to tell you about me. He said, I come from way back up in the hills. I just where, I don't know. But he said, I came from a real small school. And he said, I was the best student in the school. There was no question about it. I was the top student. And everybody recognized it, that this is a fellow that's got potential in his life ahead of him. And he said, I graduated. And they wanted me to go to college. And my family couldn't send anybody to college. So the townspeople, as few people as there were in that town, got together and pooled their money and sent me to Shepherd College. And that's how I happened to be there. I don't know how he got past entrance exams or anything like that, but he was there. And he said, it didn't take me long, and it doesn't now, but I realized that I don't have it. The studying and classroom stuff is not mine. He said, I got no qualms about earning a living or anything else. He was a good enough kid that you knew he was going to succeed somehow. Mm-hmm. But he was sitting there and saying, I just wanted to come and thank you for putting up with me and teaching me through all of this. And he said, and listening to me come in here now and talk. But he said, I'm going to leave college. He said, I can't take money from these people. This little town, they have too little. And he said, I'm going to let them keep that. And he said, I'm going back home and probably go the direction I should have gone in the first place. But here was a kid that wanted to do for other people. They wanted him to. They thought that they had, finally, this would have been the first kid from that town to go to college. And they were willing to put up the money to have him go. And he couldn't handle it, and he knew it, and he had to go back and face these people and say, look, I haven't got it for college, and we'll save your money and use it for something else, maybe. Mm-hmm. But it was I've thought about that so many times since. Yeah. And I guess every one of us goes through a growth procedure. I was going through one right then, and he was going through one because he made the decisions that he did. And I'm absolutely sure the decisions he made were the right ones. Mm-hmm. But you run into incidents in your life all the way along that where you're picking up something that is important. I don't know if he said that he appreciated the fact that I would put up with him in my class and try to teach him in all this business. I can only hope that maybe some of me rubbed off on him as well as he rubbed off on me, because I learned a lot.
Yeah. Takes a lot of courage.
Yeah, it does. A lot of courage, because he knew that he was going to disappoint an awful lot of people. Right. Not only people he knew in town, but his parents who had to live with these people. Yeah. Everything you do, every person you meet, every event that takes place, they look like disasters at the time, but they're there for a reason. Mm-hmm. And you come through them all. Maybe not quite the way you would like. I was not the greatest financial genius in the world, and I never made any money that I didn't lose somewhere through inattention more than anything else. We always had what we wanted. We always had what we needed. And who can ask for anything more than that?